Every year in October, November, and December, all the awardsy movies, all the ones that are going to get nominated for Oscars, get released in the United States. Which is great, it's an exciting time for movies, it's the run up to the end of the year. But if you're like me and you don't live in the United States, you hear about all these movies in October, November, December, but then there's this gap where we actually don't get them till January. If you live in the US and you wanted to see A Real Pain, A Complete Unknown, The Brutalist, you've probably had the chance to see it a month before the rest of the world. And that can be kind of frustrating because even if the release of the movie is regional, now with the internet, the discussion about it is global. I have heard that Timothée Chalamet is really good as Bob Dylan, but I'm still waiting for the chance to find out for myself. So why do they do this? Why do they stagger the release dates? And why do they stack all the Oscar movies at the end of the year? Well, it's of course to do with Oscar campaigning. The Oscars usually take place in February or March, and they're awarding the best work in film of the previous year. And so, of course, the only ones that are eligible for awards are the ones that have been released between January and December of the previous year. So studios, if they think their film has a chance of getting nominated for an Oscar, they'll schedule it towards the end of the year when it's fresh in voters' minds. They're betting on the recency bias that voters will be more likely to vote for their film rather than one released in January or February. The other reason for the end of year release dates is if the film gets a lot of buzz, it means that they can ride the momentum of that all the way through Oscar season. It's a much shorter window of time that they have to keep their film in the spotlight. And if we look at the numbers, it makes a lot of sense. Of all the Best Picture winners of the last 50 years, an overwhelming majority of them have been released in October, November, and December. In fact, since 1974, only 7 movies released in the first half of the year, that's between January and June, have won Best Picture. So for the best chance of getting your film nominated for Best Picture, release it at the end of the year. But why do they then stagger the release dates? Well, staggering release dates is just another way for them to generate buzz and momentum for their Oscar campaign. If they release in December, they'll get one initial big burst of publicity, and then when they get their second release in January, they'll get a whole nother round of publicity and press as well. And it works because American discussion about the film is global. I mean, the fact that I'm even annoyed about having to wait for releases in January just shows how their strategy works. But doing this actually has a kind of funny side effect for international awards ceremonies, because you'd think for something like the BAFTAs, the British Academy of Film and Television Awards, that if they're handing out trophies for films released in 2024, that movies released in January of 2025 would obviously be ineligible. But no, they've actually set their eligibility rules to make it the same movies that are going for Oscars that are going to be nominated for BAFTAs. The films that are eligible have to have been released theatrically between January and February of the following year. So technically, you could release a film in January of this year and be eligible for either this year's BAFTAs or next year's BAFTAs, which is kind of crazy. And so because the studios want to get all the buzz in December and then get the awards in February, that means all the releases end up getting squeezed into January. Now that said, it could be a lot worse. Back in the day, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest got released in November in the United States and didn't get released until the end of February in the rest of the world. At the end of the day, it's not that long a wait between the movies getting released in the United States and between when I get to see them. But, and this is the real motivation behind making this video, it's really frustrating if I want to make a top 10 list of my favourite films of the last year and I have to wait until the end of January to do that. That's why at the end of December I made a top 10 posters of 2024 video, because they all get released at the same time. So I don't think the gap between them being released in the US and being released elsewhere would bother me as much if I wasn't wanting to do a full roundup of my favourite films of the year. That said, there are some things I quite like about the January release dates. January can be quite a dreary month, especially right after Christmas, so it can be quite nice to have all these great movies packed into such a short period of time. It's just something nice to look forward to in the new year. But if you're outside of the US like me, is this something that bothers you as well? If you're in the US, is this something you've ever thought about at all? Let me know in the comments. There were some really interesting ones in the last video, so keep them coming. And if you want to make sure that you're not missing anything coming up on the channel, make sure to subscribe.